This is Martin Giles of the Guildford Dragon News, and I'm pleased to welcome Councillor Fiona White to the Dragon. Councillor White has decades of experience as a county and borough councillor. She was Guildford's first female and first Lib Dem council leader. And when was that, Fiona? Can you remind me?
Oh gosh, it was a long time ago. It was the first ever council leader of any party, because it was after the after we moved to cabinet local government. So it was
right, okay.
back in 2000, I think.
Yes, early part of this.
Very old.
Okay, sorry, but okay. Now, you're the chair of Guildford Borough Council's Planning Committee currently, which is obviously a challenging job, especially during this period of several major and controversial planning decisions. So thank you very much for being prepared to be interviewed. And I should explain that I have been asked to interview you on planning rather than the council leader, Julia McShane, who I hope to interview on other subjects soon. Okay. So what is the Liberal Democrat vision for Guildford in terms of development?
I think in terms of development, one of the things that we do feel is a priority is the provision of affordable housing. We need the sort of housing that local people need. And that's not always what developers want to build, to be quite honest with you. There are brownfield sites in Guildford, particularly in the town itself, and it is important that those come forward and they should be developed before we look at any further greenbelt releases. I think also we need the right sort of design in Guildford. You know, it needs to reflect the character of Guildford as it is. We do need housing. We definitely do need housing, but as I said, it has to be the right sort. But we also need to encourage business and employment. We need vibrant communities. So those are all things that ought to be a part of the planning process. Okay,
on style though, it is very difficult, isn't it? When a site is worth a certain amount of money, the viability argument kicks in, and that seems to drive building height. So what would the Lib Dems do about that?
Well, we can always only act in accordance with national planning policy. So to some extent that restricts whatever we would like to see. And I think I'd really like to see some major changes to planning, national planning policy.
Okay, and let's if you don't mind, we'll park that for the minute.
Okay, that's
because
fine.
I would like to explore that in a bit more detail.
Absolutely.
And sorry, go on.
You're right that viability is an issue, but within that, especially for major sites, there are all sorts of different options that could come forward. And I mean, we've got a local plan, and really developers ought to be looking at that local plan as their first port of call when they come to designing a development.
Right.
And that includes our SPDs or development management policies on design, for example, and character, excuse me, and how that fits in to whatever part of the borough the development is designed to take place in.
Now, planning is one of the borough's borough council's most important but potentially divisive responsibilities. Is there no party line on planning decisions? How do, if there aren't any, how do voters know what they're voting for at elections?
There can't be party lines on a planning committee. It's absolutely prohibited. It is called predetermination. If there is an attempt to whip a party, to use the sort of political vernacular, into voting a certain way on a planning committee, those members should not be a part of that particular committee. People can decide what to vote for based on the overall policies of each individual party. But then it depends on the applications themselves that come forward and the detail in those applications, and to what extent they follow the local plan, which of course is, as somebody told me many years ago, our planning Bible, our first port of call when we're judging planning applications.
Okay, so if you're in election campaign mode, you go to a doorstep and someone says, I really like modern architecture. Are you going to get modern architecture into Guildford? What would you say to them?
I would tell them that we would look at how any design fits into the character of the area. So it would depend on which part of Guildford, what the actual setting of that development is.
So all you can really say, and I presume you're saying that all any candidate should say, is that they will judge each application on its merits, which is, of course, yes, what you as chair often say during the planning meetings.
Yes, I'm afraid people are fed up with hearing me say that, I think. But, you know, as I said, there is an absolute prohibition. It's not me who makes that rule. It is a national rule that we must not be predetermined. If we are, we shouldn't sit on the committee. And therefore, there can't be a party line. However, I stand, and other candidates stand as well, based on the overall manifesto of our party. And those are the sort of things that we would pursue. And I assume other parties as well that would be pursued when trying to negotiate with developers, for example.
Okay, but would you say in your manifesto, the Lib Dem party prefers traditional architecture?
I'm not going to try and write a Lib Dem manifesto.
No, but could any party say such a thing?
It might be a bit of a hostage to fortune. To be quite honest, Martin, I hadn't thought about it to that extent. Okay. So it could be a bit of a hostage to fortune.
I'm sorry to labour the point, but it's just that you know, there are strong feelings about the style of architecture in Guildford, as you know, as well as anyone.
Yes.
And voters for voters, that might be the important issue when they're deciding which way to vote. But what you're saying is that actually parties can't actually predetermine their choice because they have to judge each application on its merits. Is that the fair summation?
Absolutely, but also against planning policies. So right. I referred earlier to the policy on design and character and historic settings and things like that. So all that has to be taken into account.
Okay, now on the North Street one, I know you don't want to go into too much detail on it, but can you just explain why the Lib Dem members on the planning committee voted against when previously Lib Dem, we're told, Lib Dem members of the executive seem to be in favour?
I go back to my previous answer. There were debates, as I understand it, within the executive, and I wasn't a party to those debates or any of the discussions that took place. But I go back to my previous answer that what executive members of the Liberal Democrats may or may not have said during those debates cannot be binding on planning committee members.
Okay, but shouldn't the shouldn't councillors generally have attended the briefings that were available on that application before it came to the decision? I
think most councillors did. I mean, I can't answer for who attended which briefings. I know okay. I attended some of them. I can't guarantee I attended every single one of them.
Okay, there has been some comment made that people didn't attend, but I haven't got the evidence, so I won't pursue it. Yes, now, what happened to the 3,000 council houses promised by the Lib Dems in the 2019 local election campaign?
Well, my memory is that that was over a period of 10 years rather
Yes,
than
that's
within
correct.
a 4-year period.
It was, yeah.
So work in progress, I think. There is also the difficulties with planning policy and that sort of thing. Not only that, but things like construction costs, for example, are beginning to impact very much on the way development or the costs of actually building out any development. So that to some extent has an impact. Now, I can't answer your question absolutely, but there are a number of things that have to be taken into account. And as I said, it was over a 10-year period. That still absolutely remains our target, because it's important to us, and I believe to all councillors, that we need to provide the sort of housing that local people need.
Well, but we are 4 years through that 10-year period, so, and we, as far as I'm aware, there have been very few council houses built in that time.
I honestly can't answer that question, Martin. I don't have that information to hand,
Okay.
and I'm not going to make it up.
No, okay, fair enough. Now, can local authorities really exercise control of planning under the pro-development strictures of our current national planning policies?
It's very, very difficult because I think you've been to a number of our planning committee meetings, and you will have seen time after time councillors from all different parts of the borough having concerns about what the applications before us are, and time after time they have been referred to national planning policies on the basis of, you know, there isn't a policy to support what you want to do, or there is a policy that says that, you know, you can't refuse it for those reasons. I would very much like to see national planning policy changed, and we keep getting statements from the Secretary of State for whatever, actually sort of saying, oh, we're going to change planning policy to do X, Y, Z. But until those changes are made formally, we as a local authority can only deal with planning issues based on current government policies and guidances. So, you know, the national planning policy framework, we have to go to that every single time and see if there is something in there that enables us to do what we actually want to do.
So is our planning policy and process functional at the moment?
It doesn't work for local people because it doesn't meet what they want, or dare I say what they need, which is the sort of housing. Time after time, I get people saying to me that their adult children can't afford to go and live somewhere else because the cost of housing in Guildford is so high. We know there are difficulties in recruiting teachers and nurses and police officers. Very often they have to work in Guildford and travel long distances from where they live because they can't afford to live locally. That actually is wrong. We shouldn't have a planning system that means it's impossible for local authorities to actually insist on building what people need.
And presumably you mean that are financially within reach of these people that you mentioned?
Yes. And a wide, I mean, we need a variety of housing. I'm not saying, you know, that we should only build one type of housing, but I think there is far too much emphasis on the larger and possibly more expensive homes. and it is too difficult for local authorities as planning authorities to insist on the sort of affordable housing that people really need here.
Okay, thank you. Now, we've got the election coming up in 2023, the Borough Council election. Who should someone who's happy to see development but does not want to see the character of the town change significantly, who should they vote for in 2023?
Now, you know, I'm always going to tell everybody that they should vote Liberal Democrat.
Okay, so how are you going to do that then?
What I would say to anybody is challenge candidates on the doorstep. Ask them what their views are. Ask them how they would deal with that problem.
Okay, but you did earlier say that they won't be able to, or candidates shouldn't promise any particular line on planning.
Absolutely, but there is a principle that political parties will follow. Now, my principle is that planning should meet the needs of local people. It has to follow, absolutely, government legislation. And I go back to my earlier response that legislation needs to change, so that we hear so much about localism and people, national politicians say we will leave local people to decide, but then they ring fence it so much with other things that actually that decision isn't available to local people. And on such things as planning and the character of our town, the character of areas around our town, our countryside, should really be as local a decision as it possibly can be.
But under the current policies, isn't it just inevitable that Guildford will see more and more urbanisation, contemporary architectural styles, and we just have to like it or lump it?
I think it depends on whereabouts it is in the town. I referred earlier to historic settings and things like that. And that applies to large parts of the borough, that, the setting of any development, probably an urban development wouldn't look right there. We need to have design policies that can enable us to work, provide a framework within which those decisions can be made. It is difficult because there have been a lot of, under the local plan, which, by the way, I would not have voted for had I been a councillor in April 2019. But there were a lot of greenbelt releases. And I know people in those areas feel quite strongly that the developments don't match the character of their communities either. And again, I think that is something that local people should be able to determine as far as they possibly can.
Councillor Fiona White, Chair of the Guildford Borough Council Planning Committee, thank you very much.
Thank you, Martin.